catch you off. Woody Guthrie's book House of Earth was published just 5 years ago. It's a story of love and of longing. Echoing Guthrie, but a century and a half earlier, Arthur Young, while travelling through County Meath, observed that if the Irish cabins continue like what I have hitherto seen, I shall not hesitate to pronounce their inhabitants as well off as most English cottagers. They are built of mud walls, 18 inches or 2 feet thick and well thatched, which are warmer than the tin walls in England. There you are now. That was then anyway. It is true that they have not always had chimneys to their cabins, the door serving for that and the window too. If their eyes are not affected with smoke, it may be an advantage in warmth. Every cottage swarms, of course, with poultry, and most of them have pigs. So there you are. Food on site. This assessment of earthen houses and their frugal comforts is extremely benign for the time and for a considerable period afterwards. About 1814, bringing it back local, clay houses in Wexford were being praised for being neat, clean and commodious. The surprising expertness with which clay is handled and moulded into habitable form makes stone altogether unnecessary. With a compost of moistened clay and straw, without plumb, square or level, but merely a sprong or hayfork, every man is capable of erecting a house for himself, compact and perpendicular. Arthur Young also sets out the cost of different house types in 1770s. In Roscommon, a mud house cost £5 and 5 shillings, and a stone and slate one £15, so about 3-to-1 ratio there. In Cavan, a mud house cost £4 and a stone and lime one cost £17. So you could build your mud house for about a quarter or maybe even a fifth of the cost of a stone one at the time. The statistical survey of 1802 for Armagh sets out the cost more precisely. It gives the prices for different elements of building work. For mud work and plastering, £3 8 shillings and sixpence. Apologise to the non-Irish or British people here because this just means nothing. Roofing cost £1 14 shillings 1.5p or D. Thatching a straw £2 5 shillings and sixpence, and door and leaded windows £1 1 shilling and 4.5 pence. Anyway, the bottom line there essentially is wood, wall and plastering part of the job comprised a major component. It cost certainly more than the thatching and the straw work and all the other joinery work put together. So it was a major component, major investment for anybody, even though the sum seems quite small today. Now just to put us into context, everybody here is familiar probably with these photographs. There's one person here that has it in his book. For images certainly of mud buildings built by hand is superb, and also some of the books by Paul Oliver, the late Paul Oliver. Keep going for a moment. So I'm not going to dwell at all on this stuff. It's just to say we have a context and it's the world, and mud is global.
Where's the city?
It's Sana'a in Yemen. So Yemen is a bit out of bounds at the moment, unfortunately. It is assumed that clay walls were introduced by the Anglo-Normans in the 12th century. Indeed, at Loughgur, County Limerick, houses dating to this general period, 1250 to 1350, were built of clay around a framework of timber. At Carrigwillimore in the same county, clay was used as a mortar in stone foundations of two medieval houses. The earliest houses of settlers in the plantation of Ulster, so the first decade of the 17th century, echoed native housing, with walls of either clay or clay with post and wattle. This time, native housing was of clay or it was a post and wattle. This seems to be the consensus from the documents anyway. By the 1620s, planter settlements were dominated by timber frame houses, and these are very familiar in the maps at the time. The civil survey of the 1650s lists large numbers of timber cage work houses, particularly in the larger towns, but also many stone houses. The latter material, stone, is increasingly common in the 17th century, particularly for larger houses. Clay, however, remains popular, but it's rarely mentioned in the civil survey. Now, it's a patchy enough document. At the close of the century, John Dunton, a sympathetic visitor, writing in 1699, described house construction. He was quite detailed about it. They build them by putting two forked stakes of such length as to intend the height of the building. and at such distance as they design its length. They raised a wall which they make of clay and straw, tempered with water, and this they call mud. They still call it mud. Which wall is raised to a sufficient height which perhaps is 4 foot. Then they lay other small sticks at one end on the ridge pole and the other on the wall. These they wattle with small hazels and then cover them with straw or coarse grass, without any chimney, so that when the fire is lighted, smoke will come out through the thatch. The building on the top right is actually a watermill from North County Dublin, and it's mentioned certainly in the late 16th century, and it's just a quick date, I'd say, around 1600. So vernacular buildings aren't all 18th and 19th century. There's this general attitude in the country that should are only 19th century buildings because they sort of associate them to some degree with the Great Famine. It's sort of a bizarre concept, but anyway, it sort of sticks. But I certainly know of a handful of 17th century vernacular houses around the country. They're a bit more common in some of the northern counties, on account of the also plantation and documentation and trucks and so on. The house on the bottom right is the May Glass House, which has possibly already been mentioned at the Clayfest, and will be certainly mentioned at the end of the day by Pat Luan, unless he's Scarpus. The illustration at the bottom left is from the Ordnance Survey map of 1837, and it's of what I call a townland house. And there was the largest house in the townland, one which has the name of the townland, which is the smallest unit of territory in Ireland. It's below the level of parish. And this building, when I visited, well, you can't see it, but it's here. This building was still occupied, but only half occupied. It was largely clay built, and half of the building had actually collapsed, but they were still living in the other half. But the point is that it was a townland house, the largest house in the townland with the name of the townland. And in my experience, they tend to be quite early buildings. Certainly, I'd say first half of the 18th century, but more likely 17th century in date. And this is the house at Lochgur, which is the best representation we have of an early clay house. There are clear associations between clay walls and hip roofs, and to a slightly lesser extent, houses of lobby empty plan, that is, houses which have the jam wall feature, which is familiar across the water, between the kitchen hearth and the entrance doorway. So jam walls, clay walls, hip roofs, put them together, work out the proportions of commonality, and you can do a very, very simple illustration like this to show the relative strength of connection between them. Structural stability is probably the main reason for these associations. Where clay buildings are gabled, the gables may be of stone, although many are of concrete, especially where corrugated roof covering has been applied. There are thousands of single-story buildings around the country, perhaps less than 100 two-story examples, and these are mostly found in the eastern and southeastern counties. Okay, so it's just to be aware that clay doesn't exist in a vacuum. It's related to other elements of the vernacular house and outbuildings. This is from this illustration is from the Built by Hand book. The others are from different parts of the country. I'm not going to dwell on any particular illustrations. Buildings wholly or partly of clay are found throughout the island of Ireland. Clay wall buildings are found in those districts with deep border clay underlying good soils, especially in lowland areas. Regions that apparently lack clay wall buildings are most of Donegal, much of Tyrone, West Mayo, much of Galway, Northwest Clare, Southwest Cork and Kerry, as well as upland pockets elsewhere. In these areas there was a general shortage of deep soil suitable for the extraction of building clay. In Offaly, for example, a strip 10 to 15 miles wide along the River Shannon has been observed to have no clay wall buildings. Elsewhere in that county, stone and clay buildings are intermixed, but clay gets stronger and stronger the further east you go. Common words for earth walling in Ireland, and this was I was reminded to say something about this by Fela, who sent me an email about the different words for clay, and it should be very straightforward to come up with the words, but it's not so easy, particularly if we're looking through the Irish language material. The common words for earth walling in Ireland among owners and students of vernacular architecture. One of the real nuisances of vernacular architecture is there's no nice, handy term to describe people who are involved in the trade. So we end up calling students of vernacular architecture people who are interested in. It's not like an engineer or a plumber or a mechanic. So these people, owners and students, would use the terms mud and clay, more particularly yellow clay. The terms earth and cob are not familiar in Ireland, except perhaps in the property media and some other aspects. And the use of the two sets of terms, mud and clay on the one hand and earth and cob on the other hand, is not dissimilar to the usages of house and cottage. Frequently people in Ireland increasingly describe thatched houses as cottages or thatched cottages, which isn't a correct usage at all. Cottage is a term best used for houses supplied or built for people by estates or the state. So I just make that distinction. So it's just usages aren't necessarily familiar in Ireland. Where for academic purposes the term cob has gained some currency internationally, being used in the Atlas of Vernacular Architecture of the World 2007 and also in Terra Europea, the urban architecture in the European Union book that came out in 2011. In the Irish language the terms doib, D-O-F-A-I-B, and cray, C-R-E, accent. Cray is a very general word for clay, and doib is an equivalent for daub, I suppose. The Irish Folklore Commission issued a questionnaire on the subject of traditional materials back in 1946, on which Queevy O'Donoghue, also known as Kevin Danaher, wrote an article which he published in 1957. And then just to describe the process as presented by Danaher and others. The Clayford building was brought in from communal pit, usually no more than a few hundred metres from the site of the proposed building. Lumps were broken down and stones larger than 25 millimetres were discarded. Water was added to the clay and the mixture brought to a doughy consistency with pitchforks and shovels. Otherwise the mixture was trampled by bare feet, especially those of children, or by cattle or sheep being driven back and forth through it, or by horses or donkeys being ridden through it. It was reinforced by adding in rushes or cereal straw, hay or coarse grass, or twigs or furze as the mixture was turned over. Lime and cow dung might also be added, and there are traditions of using milk, buttermilk, ashes, and animal blood. The mixture was left for some days to temper or sour to absorb the moisture, and was turned over occasionally. More water was sprinkled on, and the mixture again left to temper a few more days until firm enough to use in construction. Many clay buildings lacked a foundation. Others were laterally given a foundation by digging out part of the base of the wall and replacing this with stone, or sometimes a concrete block. More generally, the wall trench about 50 centimetres wide was dug to subsoil level and filled with stone, with uncoarse clay mortar stone foundation about 30 to 50 centimetres above ground. There are many instances, however, of clay walls having stone bases 1 to 1.5 metres high. The top course of stonework is left irregular, the key in the clay superstructure, which averaged between 45 and 70 centimetres. The lower end of the scale being equivalent to the average thickness of vernacular stone walls in Ireland. However, clay walls up to a metre or more are not uncommon. In outbuildings, walls are occasionally as thin as 30 centimetres. Walls were built to an average height of about 1.95 metres in layers or lifts, 30 to 45 centimetres or a foot to a foot and a half, those using old money, high, and about 5 centimetres wider than the required thickness to allow for drying and heating down. The material was then cut into rough blocks by spade or shovel and lifted into position on the wall with shovels or hay forks. When I say blocks, I mean lumps really, rather than anything shaped. While the material was still plastic and then rammed down hard. When hardened, each layer was pared to the required thickness and degree of verticality with sharp spades, or in parts of Armagh, for example, a spoke shave-like tool about 40 centimetres long with a hand on each side was used to do the paring. The parings, people will be glad to know, were recycled back into the mixture. Chopped straw, rushes or twigs were then sprinkled over each layer for adhesion and to prevent the wall drying out too quickly. Walling was allowed to harden for 1 to 2 days depending on the weather. Seashell, animal hair, pebbles and crockery also found as constituents, the latter two perhaps accidentally incorporated. An analysis of samples in 1995 in North Dublin gave fine sand 30%, small residual stones 25%, coarse sand 20%, clay 20%, straw 1%, and water and other substances 4%. If anybody wants a copy of this, I can give it to them, send it to them if they send me their email, or give it to me later on. It appears that the use of timber shuttering to form clay walls was uncommon. One area that did feature the technique was North Armagh. 2 boards of split fir from the bog were nailed together to provide shuttering 45 centimetres high, propped up with sticks to keep them vertical. As the wall hardened, the shuttering was moved further up. The walls were often tapered or battered on one or both sides for stability, and in Tyrone in 1802 a graduated thickness of 70 at the base and 55 at the wall head was recommended. And you know, battering can be internal, it can be external, there can be local patterns to that. In a study that I did in North Dublin, 30 of the 80 clay wall buildings have reinforcement of some kind. 13 were battered, 10 buttressed, and 7 battered and buttressed. Many clay walled houses have a windbreak at their entrance, which is a particularly vulnerable point, I'd say, because they've opened up the wall to a great height. And these windbreaks, in effect, also act as buttresses. Right, Danaher claimed that it was general to build gables of stone, but I've seen plenty of clay gables, so I don't think it was a big deal necessarily to build a full height clay gable. Often a piece of wood such as a curved branch was placed at the corners of the building as the walling proceeded to add further strengthening and adhesion. And in Armagh they actually used old wire for the same function. Rounding of the corners also helped prevent damage, and large stone often placed at the corner to deflect cartwheels and animals. And then the window and door openings were evened off with spades and provided with temporary sawn or rough timber jambs and lintels. And then later on, when the walls were finished, they'd come back and put in proper frames. So then clay plastering, lime wash. In Armagh they used tar to protect the base of the walls from rain splash. And it's going to mention also the idea that, again, clay doesn't necessarily occur on its own, apart from stone foundations, but it can actually be intermixed with stone in a more thoroughgoing way. In North Dublin, clay buildings account for 35% of vernacular structures. Stone is 45%, and the other 20% is composite clay and stone. Your clock is really flying there, isn't it? I've seen 3 particular configurations of stone and clay. Clay over 1 metre to 1.5 metres, clay upper gables over stone, and clay sandwich between stone, or stone sandwich between clay. And this is a building here at Donaghbate in North Dublin. And the front wall is largely clay, back wall is clay over 1 metre to 1.5 metres stone, and the internal wall is stone, gable is stone up to eaves level, and then clay above that. So you get these permutations, and I think they're interesting to note and important to note. And this is an example over here of stone, of a clay building with stone, but also with some heavy point stones to add further protection at the edges. And you can see stone upper gable to a clay building here, and then this is this out of 28, 50 odd buildings. You can see these sort of numbers that have the different permutations of heights of stone walls and so on. Okay, now clay and post construction is not very familiar at all in Ireland, but in some districts they did have it. It's a method, the idea of using timber posts within walling, something that's very much a feature of grass sod buildings, which I'd be very surprised if any survive today, but they were quite common right into the 19th century, and they made for some of the most miserable housing additions anywhere probably in Europe. In Cavan they set up posts, and the posts were set up first, and parts of Cavan they set up the posts first, and then they added the roof, they connected roof timbers in, and then they added the clay work. There are all sorts of different practices in different parts of the country, historically at least. I'm going to say historically up to 50 or 60 years ago anyway. Some houses in the town of Skerries in North County Dublin were observed by local tartan to have timber posts within their clay walls, and there are lots of other examples from obviously Cavan and so on. This is a building from Slane in County Meath, which very clearly has timber posts right the way through it. It was recorded as it was falling down, which is the usual thing. The only way to see the innards of something is when it's actually collapsing into a state of ruin. And then I've plotted the examples that I'm aware of clay timber post construction. Clay and wattle is very, very familiar in Ireland, particularly in partitions within buildings, sometimes in gables, and certainly in wattle canopies for chimneys. I'm not going to go into it, we'll keep us here for another 20 minutes, and I know somebody will get out to me if I continue on too long. Clay lump is a term which is used for all sorts of variants, I think, of clay work where the units are very small. So this is a lovely contrast in County Monaghan between mass walling in clay and then smaller units, clay lumps. They're not regular enough to be what I would call clay block. I think the term clay block is maybe not a bad term to use. I'll mention that in a minute. And this is a building in Tipperary, which part of which collapsed and it exposed a very interesting clay lump, which is vertically organised, as seen from more horizontally in the Monaghan case. Generally speaking, people, and myself included, would have talked about buildings being clay or stone or whatever it is, without getting into nitty gritty. But preparing for this talk actually got me looking properly at a lot of the stuff. 10 minutes left, okay. Right, so this is what I call more clay block proper. Some houses in Fermanagh and into Cavan were observed to have clay block as a constituent. So about 50 centimetres long by about 15 to 20 centimetres thick. And these again only found as buildings are falling down. But it is something, so in other words, there are a number of different methods of construction within the whole sort of clay genre which need to be borne in mind. I mentioned wattle canopies and so on, an example of clay canopy on a house. Clay flooring, the made glass house, which will be mentioned again and again, which is made of unfired clay bricks. Now, clay in thatching is something that people don't think about. Clay as a roofing material. North East Scotland has had lots of examples of clay being used as a layer over the whole of the roof during the thatching process. In Ireland, it was used in South East Down and a couple of other localities where they placed mud at the eaves, mid-roof and at the ridge. And in North County Dublin, there you are now, they have a different variant of it where you applied 2 layers of clay at the eaves only. So the use of clay in thatching is something which is a feature of Ireland as well as a couple of other places. And then this illustration up here is an example from a ruined house that was being demolished. I helped to demolish it, which is the nicest way to do it. And they put a sloping layer of clay at the eaves, into which they pegged a straw rope and used that straw rope then as an anchorage point for the pinning of straw bundles at the eaves. And that's everything contracted there into a short sentence. There's a detail of it here on the right. Okay. Now, yes, last slide. Right, last slide. 1942 was what we called the emergency, what the rest of the world calls the Second World War. there was a shortage naturally of building material, and a guy called Frank Gibney, who is an architect, made a proposal to the Industrial Research Council that we develop the idea of building in clay as a means of getting around the shortage of materials, and also as a way of sort of kick-starting an old tradition. And he said that the only thing that would act as a block would be psychological. The idea that mud is associated with poverty, famine, harsh times, and we want to get away from that miserable way of life, and we want to get into authority houses and bungalows and all the rest of it slightly later. But anyway, he ran this particular flag up the flagpole, and it went down in flames. In the best bureaucratic sense of just sort of ignoring it. No, it didn't happen, but somebody back in the 40s was thinking clay. I think because at the time there was folk life research and so on taking place, and it all sort of made a critical mass, but it unfortunately didn't go anywhere. This is mud walls that never were. The one on the right is the mud walls that sort of vanished. When I was doing field work, came across this house and I thought, is that a labourer's house of the 30s, 40s, or is it something else? And it was actually something else. It's actually a concrete block house, but it had been mud. And what they did was they took out the mud gradually over a period of time. Back in 1967, when everybody was getting very modern, they took out the old fireplace, they took the thatch off the roof and put on glazed tiles, and they removed the clay walls bit by bit and replaced them with concrete block. Probably took them the whole year to do it in 67. And so that's just a sort of an extreme example of how clay can disappear, but yet you need enough of the character, the space in the windows, enough of like me to spot it, and you can sort of see that it had been a clay wall building. They often say, you know, that expression, you can run but you can't hide. This is proof that clay walls can run as well as hide. So leave you on that sort of slightly humorous note.